Welcome to Miniatures Rundown. I'm Kevin, and today I'm giving myself to the Dark Gods. So, Chaos Space Marines are, of course, a iconic army in Warhammer 40,000, and the same is true going into 11th. They are still as present as ever, causing havoc across the galaxy, and they're an army that's close to my heart. They were one of my first armies back in 3rd edition, the vaunted 3.5 for you old heads out there. Chaos Space Marines, I've always had a soft place in my heart for them, having built a few warbands over the years and a couple of armies, actually having done a Red Corsairs army back before that was even a thing. And I'm really excited to see what is coming down the pike for them and the things that are useful for them now and some things that are a little less useful here in 11th edition that I think are really, really cool. Now, just like our other reviews of the armies going into 11th, I'm not going to go through every data slate. I'm not going to read through every detachment. That would be boring for you, and it would be just a lot to go over. There's tons. They have tons of detachments, and they have tons of data sheets. But I'm going to give you the highlights and things that I'm excited for, and I'm going to start with their army rules. So, of course, one thing they had in 10th that really defined them was their Dark Pacts. So it hasn't changed at all in 11th. They're the exact same army rule. You can choose lethal hits or sustained hits. Both of those are really, really great. And of course, there's ways to be able to activate both of them. Of course, with Dark Pacts, you still have to take the leadership test. If you don't, then you take, D3 mortal wounds. You're almost always going to be triggering Dark Pacts unless you feel like you really don't need it. But for a lot of the units in your army, they're getting the most value out of them when they are under a Dark Pact. So I really think that army rule is still very useful. Both lethal hits and sustained hits are really great. Lethal hits specifically, if you find yourself in a situation where you're going up against something with really high toughness and you really just need to put the hurt on it, even the lowly bolter can start to do some damage to bigger units like knights and whatnot if you have lethal hits. Speaking about a few things that kind of aren't so great going into 11th, I'm going to talk about the Helldrake. I love the Helldrake. The Helldrake is an iconic piece of 40k lore ever since it came out, just being a warped fighter jet that turned into a demon engine over the millennia caught in the warp. And I think it's such a cool model, having a big metal dragon flying over the battlefield. Well, flying may not be the right word anymore because they don't have the fly keyword. They have hover, which is pretty bad. The change to aircraft in 11th is a really cool change. I really like what they did with the aircraft keyword, because how they operate now is, to just give you a short lesson how aircraft work now, is that they come in anywhere on the battlefield, they get to shoot, they can't charge, they can't do anything else like that, but then they stick around for the opponent's turn and then they leave the battlefield again and go back into reserves. So they basically do a strafing run. They're present for long enough for the opponent to react to them and shoot at them, and then they leave and then they go back and they do another strafing run if they've survived that. I think it would have been so cool to have the Helldrake be able to come in and then spew its fire and then take off into the skies once again, going back for another run. Maybe even having a rule where when it leaves the battlefield, it can do D3 mortal wounds or something in a line or whatever with its talons, rather than making it hover. So it has to take to the skies to ignore terrain, and it has for its points, its weapon isn't all that great, and its melee isn't all that great either. So pretty disappointing about the Helldrake. I'm not super thrilled to field the Helldrake in any of my Chaos Space Marine armies, but let me know if you think I'm wrong. Let me know if you think the Helldrake is secretly a great unit and we're just all really wrong about it. I'd love to hear about it. But aside from the poor Helldrake, there are some really cool things that have come about, and especially towards the end of 10th edition, going into 11th edition, and I had mentioned the Red Corsairs. I had collected some in the past. Bad Ab War is a really cool part of the lore. I think that once again, Games Workshop has done a really good job with the models in this part of the game with the Red Corsairs themselves. And specifically, that they've done a good job with the Red Corsairs Reeve Captain and the Red Corsairs Raiders specifically. And of course, the glow up the Tyrant himself, Huron Blackheart and his friends. not just his friends as in the Red Corsairs, he actually has an entourage, which is a combination of really cool models. There's some Astartes in there. There's a Chaos Apothecary in there. Not like you see like a Plague Doctor in Death Guard, but actually an Apothecary that's turned traitor, which is pretty cool. And even an alien bodyguard. So you kind of really get this feel for like a piratical faction in Chaos Space Marines with the Tyrant and his entourage. But the Red Corsairs themselves, between the Raiders and the Reeve Captain, they still look like Chaos Space Marines, but they're not quite as covered in Chaos iconography as the rest of them. They very much look like Renegade Marines, which is a really cool concept. And not to mention that the Red Corsair Raiders are really good in melee, and them all having infiltrate and being able to infiltrate up and having that early threat with charging being so much easier than it has been in the past, you can get some early pressure on in the game. But aside from the cool things that the Red Corsairs bring to the table, they have such a rich selection of detachments, and they actually have a fair number of 3 detachment point detachments, notably among them Creations of Bile. A lot of the 3 detachment point ones are pretty obvious why they are. They've always been really strong, and Creations of Bile, of course, being an extremely strong one where you get to modify your units and with some pretty potent upgrades. And also too with that, like Packbound Zealots is of course another one, seen a lot of competitive play, and often for that reason it's really good at winning games, so it's stuck at 3 detachment points. Renegade Raiders is also 3 detachment points, so because it has a lot of run and charge, a lot of really great enhancements that really force multiply your army for the same reason. But Warp Strike Champions is really interesting. Their Warp Portals ability for their detachment rule is they can teleport, depending on the game size, teleport a number of Terminator, Obliterator, or Mutilator units that are in combat, out of combat, and they actually have to be in engagement range in order to use this ability. So you can't just teleport them around your backfield and move them around. They actually have to be engaged in order to use this. And it happens at the end of your opponent's turn. So you can really do a lot of switcheroo and what's often referred to as uppy downy in with this detachment, and I think that's really cool. And of course you can, because it's 2 detachment points, you can combine it with one of the really interesting 1 detachment point ones. For instance, you can combine that with Devotees of Destruction, which has friendly Havocs and Obliterators ranged units have heavy. Now, because the other detachment, it has you moving them around a lot, if the ones that you move around are probably not going to benefit from heavy, but you would still have Obliterators and whatnot standing around, maybe in later turns being able to benefit from that. And of course, if you have Havocs in your list as well, they would also be able to benefit from the heavy in addition. Of course, you can also combine that with Cabal of Chaos, where you can have a bunch of Psyker units and Demon Princes to further enhance and have a different threat vector from your Warp Portaling Obliterators and Terminators. So I think that's a really interesting combination of detachments and units that you can use. Also too is the Felhammer Siege Host, which is a newer detachment that came out with all the Iron Warrior stuff, and hopefully at some point getting our own Codex and maybe even Perturabo, fingers crossed, where they have Iron Fortitude, where each time a range attack targets a Heretic Astartes unit from your army, if the strength characteristic is greater than the toughness characteristic, subtract 1 from the wound roll. Having that army-wide, except for damned units, which is your cultists and your Felgors and whatnot, there is having a flat-out -1 to wound if the strength is greater is a really strong ability. That's often something you have to pay a command point for in order to have. So that's an incredibly defensive detachment, and being able to combine that also with Devotees of Destruction, which it fits really well with that, is where you have a lot of Obliterators and Havocs being able to stand by and offer that fire support, or being able to combine that with, once again, or with Cabal of Chaos, where you have your Psychers in your units and they're much harder to kill because they're benefiting from that -1 to wound from a lot of weapons that would normally, even taking a weapon that would be strength 8, which wounds most Chaos Space Marine units on 2s to 3s, is a big change in the math of how many of your guys are going to survive. There's also the Renegade Warband. So the thing that's really interesting about this is that this very much plays into the Renegade Space Marine feel and look, where they're not devoted to chaos in the traditional sense. Chaos exists. They're in opposition to the Imperium, or at least indifferent to it. So they lose Dark Pacts. And it's 2 detachment points for this. So they lose Dark Pacts. So you lose your army rule. So what do you get instead? Range weapons equipped by Heretic Astartes models, and that is everything. That includes your vehicles, that includes everything, have the assault ability. So everything you have can run and shoot, which is really, really cool. And then when mustering your army, you cannot use the Cult of the Dark Gods rule. So you can't take Khorne Berserkers, you can't take Plague Marines or Noise Marines or Rubric Marines. You can only take stuff that's in the Chaos Space Marine Codex. So what do you get? Once again, you're losing stuff, but you're getting something in return. So what are we getting? We get the Vendetta. At the start of your combat phase, select 1 unit from your opponent's army. Until the start of your next command phase, that enemy unit is your Vendetta target. Each time a Heretic Astartes model from your army, excluding damned models, so no cultists, that etc., makes an attack roll that targets your Vendetta target, you can reroll the hit roll. So you kind of get Oath of Moment, which is really cool. And you also get Twisted Doctrine. In your movement phase, each time you set up or select a Heretic Astartes unit from your army to move, it can't be battle shocked. It can choose to default to Doctrine. If it does, it must first take a battle shock test, then select one of the following. It can either shoot and declare a charge in a turn in which it fell back, until the end of the turn it is eligible to declare a charge in which it advanced. So you can select one of those if you pass the battle shock test, which you're kind of playing Space Marines. They're a little bit faster, and they are a little bit more slippery, and they get to kind of fall back on their old training in order to do certain things that they used to do back when they were serving the Emperor. This is a really cool detachment. Once again, you could play it with Red Corsairs. If you don't want to play the Raiders detachment, you can play Renegade Warband and get that feel for playing Renegade Marines that aren't necessarily dedicated to the Dark Gods, but are more just in it for themselves or fighting for some other cause. It's happened a few times in the lore, most notably the Badab War, which is where Huron Blackheart comes from and where he gets, got his issue with the Imperium for tax reasons, to put it kindly. Another thing, I'd be remiss if I was not to acknowledge the more sneaky parts of the Chaos Space Marines, which is, we're talking like Alpha Legion and Night Lords. I guess Night Lords aren't really sneaky, they're just more terrifying. But regardless, the ones that play on the psychology of the battlefield. And because Battle Shock is so much stronger in 11th edition, with it being able to, you have to test out of it now rather than automatically recovering, the things that, such as the Night Lords, are going to be a lot stronger because they're often forcing Battle Shock tests at a negative. Looking at the Murder Talon Raiders, if they target Battle Shocked unit or a unit that is below half strength, they can reroll hit rolls of 1. When an enemy units attack a friendly Heretic Astartes infantry fly unit, so your jetpacks, this is basically like, we're talking about Night Lords here. If that unit is battle shocked or below half strength, they have -1 to hit. This detachment has a Nightmare tag, and it can be combined with a Nightmare detachment. You'll often see that where 2 detachments that have very similar abilities can't be taken with each other, so you can't basically double dip into those extra abilities. It has Purge the Foe, which is really nice, but being able to take those detachments that focus on whether or not your opponent is battle shocked or forced battle shock is a lot stronger than it used to be. In 10th, you could kind of ignore battle shock for a lot of it, but in 11th, battle shock is much more impactful, and it plays really well into the Nemesis Claw, which is the kill team, also a unit in their codex, is that each time a model in this unit makes an attack that targets a unit that is below its starting strength, add 1 to the hit roll. If it's below half, you can add 1 to the wound roll as well. So not only if they're battle shocked, you get to re-roll the hit roll, hit rolls of 1, but you also get +1 to hit. If they're below their half strength, which oftentimes battle shocked units are, you get to add 1 to the wound roll as well for the Nemesis Claw. And their weapons are nothing to sneeze at. They have a lot of weapons that have 3 or 4 attacks, hitting on 3s with at least 1 AP, 2 AP in the case of the Cursed Weapon. So they could really blend through a lot of stuff. I think that that's a really interesting, and it's a big nod to people who enjoy those legions, who like Night Lords. I know they have a pretty big fan base, despite Conrad Kurz being Conrad Kurz, but hey, you like what you like. And of course, with the newer units, there's also the Mutilators, which got a major glow up. And I know it's controversial, but they do look better. I'm sorry, guys. They just do look better. Let me know how wrong I am in the comments. The new Mutilators charge in. They do mortal wounds on the charge in. They have a selection of really strong attacks. They are melee obliterators in every sense of the word. I kind of like their fleshed up. I mean, they were really fleshy before, but they looked really derpy earlier, and their glow up is a significant change in a positive way. So, you know, I really like them as a unit. I think that they're a really interesting other side of the coin to obliterators whose focus is on ranged, and they're not quite so good at melee. Their melee isn't bad. It's just for what they are, you'd rather have them shooting. Of course, anything that has fly, like raptors and whatnot, are much better in Chaos Space Marines now, similar to how assault pack units are in Space Marines, for the simple fact that it's just easier to move around the board and get into combat because the charge rules are so much more forgiving. You can do a lot more and take bigger risks with less setback. To talk about Raptors specifically, they have the Fearsome Aura. When enemy within 6 of this unit, each time that enemy takes a battle shock or leadership test, you subtract 1 from the roll. So once again, playing into that battle shock and making that a big part of your game plan, because there's very few, if anything, in the game right now that's immune to battle shock. Some things test really well on it, but for many units, it's a 6 or a 7. So the interesting thing is that there's a lot more opportunity to get that battle shock out there and force tests and make it so your opponent can't use their stratagems or can't use some abilities, because many abilities do require you to not be battle shocked. And overall, it looks like the old standbys for Chaos Space Marines are still there. You're still going to take Legionnaires. You're still going to take, a Chaos Lord to go with either your Terminators or your Chosen in order to get the most out of them, to beef them up. And I would still say that for the most part, that Chaos Space Marines in 11th are still going to be a primarily melee-focused army with enough shooting to be really threatening. But I would think that for a lot of lists, you're going to see people wanting to get in close, and the boards and the standard terrain layouts really do encourage getting close and getting in that mid to short range firefight. And I think that's where Chaos Space Marines are going to excel. Not so much in the firefight part, which they do have the firepower to do that with the right units, but they really just want to get in and chop your head off. And I don't think that you're going to stray too far away from that just because they have so many strong melee options and they have so many speedy melee options. And Chaos Space Marines also play the mission incredibly well. That with the options for either the Felgar Ravagers, who can come off the board edge a turn earlier than they normally can, or the just the Traitor Guardsmen, who can just sit and babysit an objective or do actions. I think that both of those are really useful units for those specific reasons, and they're super cheap for their points. I think that between those and the heavy hitters, you really have a good combination of things that can play the game, do your objectives, do your actions, do your secondaries, and still kill the enemy. And I think that's just a really great combination. For you Chaos Space Marine fans, or maybe folks that don't like Chaos Space Marines, what are your opinions of them going into 11th? What are you looking forward to putting in your army? What are you not looking forward to facing? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this content and want to see more, don't forget to like and subscribe. And also check out our Patreon. Every dollar helps bring this content to you, and we do truly appreciate it. Thank you for watching, and happy gaming. Glory to the Dark Gods.